Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guests today are an extraordinary couple, both writers, activists, environmentalists, naturalists. Ladies first, Terry Tempest Williams, thank you for joining us, and her husband, Brooke Williams. I'm delighted to have you here.
We're thrilled to be here, and this is the first interview we've ever done together.
Oh, that is
so
wonderful.
Thank
you.
So
what a fight.
I know.
Well, what a pleasure. You've been married 42 some odd years, and you live in Utah. You've worked together. You've been an environmental activist with the Southern Utah Alliance for 30 years.
Oh, well, not exactly. I've been a real advocate for wilderness for that long. I just worked for SUA for about 3 years.
Yeah.
In an official capacity.
And you have been writing, my goodness, for years and years. And
some would say too long, too many
No,
years.
never stop.
My father would be one of those.
No. Among your books are When Women Were Birds, and this beautiful book, a personal topography of the national parks called The Hour of Land. And I only have one of your books. You have this brand new one called Open Midnight that I'm very anxious for you to talk about. You have another one that I'd like to read called Half-Lives, Reconciling Work and Wildness.
Correct, yes. That came out a few years ago.
With a wonderful line about balancing the call of duty with the call of the wild. I really like that. So I'll start with you because this is the newest. What is Open Midnight about?
Open Midnight is really my exploration of the idea that the outer wilderness is access to the inner wilderness. And the inner wilderness is this evolutionary space where we share it with all organisms that are alive and ever have been alive, and that we have one goal, and that's passing life on to the future.
You have these lives operate on many, many levels, and there's a sense of the ancestral spirit of your great-grandfather?
Great. 3 greats.
Oh, 3 greats.
Yes.
Who emigrated from Great Britain as part of the Mormon migration to America. And so you reconnect with him on many levels.
I do. And
you still do.
I do. I don't want him to leave me alone, but I'm sure he wouldn't even if I did.
No. This is a question of genre, because one of the things you both do, you mix so many genres in such beautiful ways. In your book about mosaics, Finding Beauty in a Broken World, the very structure of the book is like a mosaic. And in the national parks, that you use kind of a dinner party of who to invite among all these wonderful parks, who to have. And in this, your editor said just because you imagined it doesn't make it fiction.
That's right. I was really wondering, I was really stymied by the fact that I had imagined a lot of it. And I thought, well, it's a novel then, but I didn't want to write a novel. I wanted nonfiction. And she set me free by saying, yeah, just because you imagined it doesn't make it fiction.
Well, it is a real treat. You're not here to talk about your book, so I'm going to have to leave it here with my heartiest recommendations that people read your books. You are involved in something called a new activism. And as you mentioned to me before, it goes back to civil disobedience. And I was going back to the old activism in 1995 when Congress was invading the Utah wilderness, and you and Stephen Trimble put together a book called Writers' Testimony, Writers Speak Out on Behalf of the Utah Wilderness. And a year later, when President Clinton comes to designate, what is the park?
Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument.
Will you tell what the president then did with your book?
Well, it was a surprise, certainly. He made this announcement on the rim of the Grand Canyon, and he held up this little book called Testimony and said this book made a difference, which was wonderful to hear. Why it made a difference is because when there's a filibuster, which the Democrats had engaged in filibuster to stop this bad bill on Utah wilderness. What one needs during that is words. And so they passed this little book around, and each senator read from it, beginning with Senator Bradley from New Jersey, and said, Senator Hatch, these lands are not your lands. These lands belong to all Americans, not just Utahns. And one of my constituents, John McPhee, says this, and he read basin range, and then he passed it on to another senator, and literally the entire book of testimonies from, I think, 32 writers from the American West was entered into the congressional record. So that was certainly unexpected.
And so effective. And for the president to acknowledge that, too, that's really a wonderful tribute. Can you trace activism a little bit through maybe Tim DeChristopher and through Standing Rock? And because you know where I'm going with this. I'm going to Tempest Exploration. But
Right.
Let's see what some of the steps along the way.
I mean, I can answer that, and then you have your point of view. I think for me, the activism began with the death of my mother and grandmothers and aunts, that I realized as a young woman at 30, that I was the matriarch of a family, that 9 women in my family had all had mastectomies and 7 were dead. And because of a dream, this flash of light in the night in the desert that kept reoccurring, my father reminded me that that wasn't a dream. You saw it. And when I said, saw what? He said, the atomic bomb. I thought you knew that. And rising up from the desert floors, we were coming back to Utah from California, where my father was in the service. I was sitting on my mother's lap. She was pregnant with my brother, Steve. And there we saw this golden-stemmed cloud, the mushroom, the atomic bomb. And in a few seconds, it was raining down on the car. It was at that moment I realized the deceit we'd been living under. Children in the American Southwest drinking contaminated milk from contaminated cows, even the breasts of our mothers, members years later of the clan of one-breasted women. And shortly thereafter, I made the decision to cross the line at the Nevada test site with other women and men and Native people as an act of resistance. So that's where it started for me. And then it progressed to the Iraq War. It progressed to, having a friendship, as you mentioned, with Tim DeChristopher, who served 2 years in prison because of an act of resistance, bidding up the oil and gas leases, 1.4 million acres, actually $1.4 million to something, I think it was, I forget the acreage, but tens of thousands. And so I think we were inspired by him, and the decision we made, which we can talk about in a minute, was really we were able to do because the price of oil fell. And so we did, we bid on oil and gas leases legally. What would you say?
I think I was pretty typical. I mean, when somebody says, I want to be an activist, I think it doesn't work so well until something taps you and something that you really care about is under threat. And for me, it started out with backcountry skiing in the Wasatch. And I loved being in these places where there were no crowds and no lifts, and just to have the freedom to ski. And I heard about some of the resorts were interested in expansion. And I remember making maps and drawing pictures and spreading them around, having a bunch of photocopies made, and taking them places and trying to let people know that, these places are under threat. And that led to working, in organized situations with the Sierra Club. And then my first trip to the desert and falling in love with this landscape and having some deep, almost spiritual connections there. And then it was, how do we save this wilderness? And I grew a little frustrated, or it just wasn't for me, all the technicalities of it, how much legalese I needed to learn and how much strategy. I just wasn't that kind of activist. So I started working on economic development aspects, because everywhere we went, people said you cannot protect this wilderness, because those of us living in these rural towns are going to suffer, that we won't be able to cut trees and drill oil wells and make coal mines if this is under protection. So I figured, if it is about money, let's think of compatible ways to make a living with the people who would come here and visit. How much money would they spend? How can we show that there's an economic development aspect of keeping things protected? And one thing leads to another. And this idea of buying these leases, to me, is it's a market-driven way to protect the land.
So we've come to Tempest Exploration. When did you start doing this? And let's just back step one little bit. Tim DeChristopher is absolutely one of my heroes. He went and he hadn't planned to, but the movie about him is called Bidder 71. He bid on these leases, and then he was sent to jail for 2 years. I interviewed him before and after, but he had told the judge, "This is what love looks like. I love my lands. I love the future, and I'm willing to make this sacrifice." And he used his time really well. So,
and he's about to graduate from the Harvard Divinity School. And I think, Tim would say, and said to us not long ago, these issues aren't just political issues, but spiritual ones. And I think we share that perspective.
So when did you start with Tempest Explorations, and where has that road taken you?
I'm laughing because it was one of those kind of miraculous things where everything just lined up and there was really no choice. It was about stepping into a stream that you thought was really calm, and all of a sudden you're just swept away. And we had this class in the fall. This all happened February of 2016. The fall before that, we had this class called Reading the Book Cliffs. Is that what it was called? Mm-hmm. Reading the Book Cliffs with graduate students from the University of Utah. And the whole purpose of the class was to analyze from many different perspectives the development of carbon in Utah. We spent a weekend in Vernal, 2 weekends in Vernal, one in Moab and one in Salt Lake. And we actually went into places where they were drilling for oil. We visited the first tar sands mine in the lower 48, which is just south of Vernal. We talked to people there. The people who owned and operated that mine would not talk to us because they didn't feel like it was in their best interest. They invited us, the whole class, and then they canceled at the last minute. So one thing led to another. The class decided that one thing they wanted to do was to protest at the next lease sale, which was the following February.
With the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management.
Go ahead.
No, go.
And so we all went, and Terry and I went just to support them. We had no plans. We just thought, this is so great that they've taken upon themselves, and they got involved with some other organizations, and there was marching and singing. And then it came time to go inside the building, and we went in, and they made us leave our backpacks, and they wanted to know who we were, so everybody had to wait in line and fill out a little form before they allowed us in. And they were prepared for this protest, so they were very well organized. And so I'm going in, and I didn't know what happened to Terry, and I looked over, and she was in a completely different line over on the edge of the room. And I
Being
thought,
an introvert, I went where it was the shortest with the least amount of people. But I would back up.
Okay.
For me personally, as Brooke said, we taught this class together, and it was instrumental in changing all of our points of view. And the students did help organize this protest. In the meantime, prior to that, I had gone to Paris, and it was during the COP21 conversations. I participated in the demonstration called the Red Line. I remember going, there were tens of thousands of people there. There was a huge banner, maybe a quarter of a mile long, that said, "Keep it in the ground." We went from the Arc de Triomphe to the Eiffel Tower, and I had been working with students, or actually young leaders in the UN Sustain Us group, and there was a lot of tension. Do they behave themselves, or do they involve in direct action? Anyway, long story shorter, we reached this hill. You could see the Eiffel Tower, And something, Lorene said to me in my heart, enough. This is not enough. And I remember stepping to the side, sitting on the ground, thinking, I have done enough marches. You know, I need to go home. Utah is ground zero for me. And I want to figure out how to keep it in the ground there. And so then when we found ourselves in this protest, I did get in the wrong line, not to my credit, but found myself in with all of the other bidders from the oil and gas industry. The protest was behind a red, rope.
Divider,
Yeah. And long story shorter, they sang, they were told to be quiet. They disrupted again. They were asked to leave, and I was there alone with the oil and gas people bidding for these leases. And as I sat there and listened to the language that was so abusive, sexual, grotesque, I just got madder and madder, and then I got sadder and sadder, and then I thought, we have to do something. And it's one of those moments where, in a way, you've been preparing for it your whole life, and my math was so bad that I couldn't figure out what we could afford. And I remember one of the agents came up and said, are you aware that if you misrepresent yourself, you will go to prison? And I said, I'm aware. As an American citizen, I have every right to be here, and I can bid on these leases if we can pay for them. And then he said, then what kind of energy are you going to develop? And I remember looking at him saying, you can no longer define what energy is for us. The energy we want to develop is the energy to fuel a movement. And that really shifted everything for us. It ended, a woman came up to me and said, you're a fraud, you had no, intention of bidding on these leases. And I said, yes, we will. We are actually buying them on sale. It was called a remnant sale. So Brooke and I made the decision to go into the BLM office. If you can imagine, these lands, our public commons, were on sale, being able to be leased for $1.50 an acre. That's less than a cup of coffee. And there together we put out the maps, we looked at where we lived in Grand County, and we found 2 parcels, one 14 miles from Arches National Park, and we purchased those leases, 1,120 acres.
And one of the problems with Tim DeChristopher when he did it, he later raised the money, but at the time he didn't have, it was a large sum of money. But at $1.50 an acre, because the price of oil and gas was lower when you did it, you could afford to actually give them then the money for this.
But the problem is they don't want people like us or Tim DeChristopher, meaning American citizens, to have our nose under the tent that is reserved for the fossil fuel industry. And if we speed ahead, we found out in October that after 9 months, they denied our leases, and we have now filed an appeal with the Department of Interior, the Board of Land Appeals. But Brooke, I think it's interesting what you found in terms of the social costs.
Yeah, we went back and forth with many different, emails and letters where they asked us questions. And what is different about what happened with Tim is the judge made it very clear that this was an illegal act, and it had nothing to do with the reason that he committed that illegal act, which was about climate change. He could not talk about that during the trial. Where in our case, all their criticism of us was our intent. And a lot of people on our side said, well, if you would have just told them that you were speculating just like everyone else, they would let you have the leases. But it was really good that we didn't, because right from the very beginning, we were very upfront with, we want to keep these fossil fuels in the ground. We think they're more valuable there. And what I did was I found an economist in Portland who has calculated the social cost of carbon. And what he has done is figured out how much greenhouse gas is produced by burning 1 barrel of oil. And then the social cost has a broad range. It goes from, $50 a barrel to $300 a barrel. And $300 a barrel is more accurate in terms of really what's happening to, the coral reefs, what's happening to agriculture, what's happening with the weather, tornadoes. And these costs are $300 are being passed into the future, and nobody's paying them. Our children and grandchildren are going to be expected to pay them later. These are what economists call externalized costs.
And what we said was, we have no intention of drilling for oil until you can show us that these fossil fuels are worth more above ground than below, given the cost to climate change and a livable future.
We're speaking today with Terry Tempest Williams and Brooke Williams. What I love that what you did was you used their own vocabulary at them. You said you can't define energy. I am fueling. That's their word. A movement. Keep it in the ground. I don't know if they noticed that, but it just made it just my eyes widened when I thought that's a perfect weapon.
Well, I think in each of our lives there is this strike moment, and you're presented with an opportunity, and how do we respond? You know, I think about that line from Emily Dickinson in a letter to her friend where she said, "Life is a spell so exquisite, everything conspires to break it." How can we not respond? You know, we didn't know what the consequences would be. You know, I essentially lost my job at the University of Utah. But, you know, Tim went to prison. Brooke and I find ourselves in a place we've never been before. But it's worth it. It's worth it because I think each of us in our own way, with the lives that are ours, can make those choices in that strike moment.
And it's almost mystical in the way that everything fell into place that day. And we kept looking at each other like we are just moving along in this, almost carried on some force. And we had no choices. And things just cleared away for us, and this is what happened. And then when we got these leases, when they were denied after 6 months, we both looked at each other and thought, you know, if they would have given them to us, then what would we have done? So...
we would have developed them
yeah.
creatively.
So we just, now it's wide open, and we're just waiting for the next step in this appeal.
The other thing, if you don't mind me saying, that was a consequence was, you know, our relationship with my father, who was in the oil and gas industry for years, in the Tempest Company. And when we came home, he was furious and just said, "You've made a mockery of our family's business." And, you know, my brothers, my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, all worked in Tempest Company, laying pipe, not the oil and gas development, but laying the pipe that accesses natural gas to homes to create warmth. And that was really painful. It was very, very painful. And I really credit you, Brooke, for bringing him in to a very different relationship with us and with, you know, we went and filed... what is it called?
We're an LLC, a limited liability
you can
corporation.
See, I don't know the money part, but the LLC, we called it Tempest Exploration. And we asked Dad if he would help us, and he said, "Over my dead body." And he really asked us to leave. And it was very painful. And we had what could have been construed as a Last Supper. And do you mind telling what you said to him?
It's kind of a long story, but I'll make it short. He and his brother were owners of the Tempest Company, and they both got to an age of retirement, and John, Terry's father, sort of turned his part of it over to Terry's brother Steve, and his brother Rich turned it over to his sons, his part of it over to his sons. And then Steve, may he rest in peace, died about 12 years ago of lymphoma. And so John, they had an arrangement so that the company went, if something like that happened, the company would go to the other brother's family. So the whole company went to John's brother's family, and he was left kind of without. And as I was thinking about it, it meant so much to him, this legacy, and it just came to me that maybe he had no idea that his legacy, the Tempest legacy, would be passed on through his daughter and not his sons.
And then the next day, you know, it was a very emotional moment. And then the next day when we came back, we'd gone out for breakfast, we came home, Dad was standing out in front of the house. And, you know, he's the Marlboro man without the cigarette. And he said, "You are both so naive that God damn it, I'm going to have to become CEO of Tempest Enterprise to protect you. And he said, I know these oil and gas men. And he said men. And I know blankety blank blank. So yes, I will become president of Tempest Exploration. So it's now a family business.
We just have really 2 minutes left. Thank you. I love how that came full circle. We're facing fracking at one of our beloved sites, Chaco Canyon, and just in the minute or so that remain, could you give a call of action for people in New Mexico to think about new ways of activism and what they can do? I love what Tim said. Activism means you have to get out of your chair. Clicking on a petition is not activism. You have to get up and do something. How do they know what to do?
My sense is that everybody has a unique way to be an activist. And if you start looking at all the way other people are activists, you might say, well, that's not for me. My sister, for instance, says, I don't really go to rallies, but what can I do? Everyone needs to look deep inside themselves, and if they look deep enough, something will appear to them that will not only make a difference, but it will be the most meaningful thing they've ever done.
And from my point of view, it's time to lay our bodies down.
Especially with this administration and the threats that public lands are under and species of life are under.
I think that time has come. How serious are we?
Well, we're so serious. I hate to leave it on that note, but that's a calling. That's the call to action. This is really serious. Our guests today are Terry Tempest Williams. I will remind you of her books, which are not about these topics. When Women Were Birds and The Hour of Land, about the national parks, a personal topography. And her husband, Brooke Williams. This is only one of his books, a really intriguing read called Open Midnight. Thank you for all you do, and thank you for sharing, your journey, because I think people will really be moved and inspired by what you have to say.
And thank you for your political engagement. You inspire all of us.
And all that you do.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to call out to the audience out there, thank you for joining us on Report from Santa Fe. And stay in touch. When you find your call to action, let us know. I'm Lorene Mills. Thank you for joining us.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.